It began not with a weapon, but with a whisper. By late 1943, the Allies knew that brute force alone would never be enough to crush the Third Reich. Europe was locked behind a wall of concrete and steel. Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a monstrous barrier stretching from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. The Führer had poured millions of tons of concrete into its veins, believing he could seal the continent from invasion. Gun bunkers, tank traps, and minefields stretched endlessly along the shore. To storm it head-on was madness, unless the Germans could be made to look the wrong way. That single thought, deception, was the seed that would bloom into one of the most daring lies in human history. In November 1943, under the cold chandeliers of the Tehran Conference, three men carved the fate of the modern world: Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, the uneasy trinity of democracy, communism, and empire. Between discussions of troop numbers and supply routes, Winston Churchill leaned forward, cigar glowing like a fuse. He spoke a single sentence that would become gospel in Allied deception doctrine. In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Those words didn't just echo, they detonated. From them came Operation Bodyguard, the grand design to cloak the true invasion of Europe in shadow. It would be a mosaic of deception, each fragment a ruse, each whisper a weapon. Beneath it, one operation would rise above the rest, Operation Fortitude, a double-edged illusion designed to paralyze the German mind. Fortitude's goal was simple yet colossal: make. Hitler believed the invasion would strike anywhere but Normandy. Convince him that the real blow would fall on Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the Channel and the most logical target. If the Germans kept their armored divisions waiting there, the beaches of Normandy would bleed less. The idea was bold. But the first drafts were not. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Sheaf, a small, smoke-filled office buzzed with tension. Major General Noel Wild, head of Oppies B, drafted the original plan. It was a script of phantom armies and vague diversions. Too tidy, too unbelievable. When Colonel David Strangeways, Montgomery's personal master of deception, read it, he tore it apart, literally. "This isn't a trick," Strangeways said, tossing the papers across the table. "It's a fantasy. If we want the Germans to believe, it has to feel real. Real soldiers. Real orders, real radio traffic, a lie so close to truth that even we forget the difference." That night, Strangeways rewrote the plan by hand. His version didn't just imagine ghosts, it gave them faces, flags, and fuel dumps. It created an army that didn't exist, the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, under the command of none other than General George S. Patton. The brilliance was instant. Patton was the Germans' nightmare made flesh. The man who had stormed across North Africa and Sicily, who cursed louder than his tanks fired. Even after he was sidelined for slapping a shell-shocked soldier, the Wehrmacht still considered him the Allies' greatest field commander. If Patton led an army, then that army had to be real. The deception machine began to turn. British intelligence's London controlling section, led by the calculating John Bevan, coordinated fake reports, forged documents, and double-agent transmissions. Radio operators mimicked entire divisions. Artists began designing dummy vehicles. The smoke of fiction thickened into the fog of war. By early 1944, Operation Fortitude had split in two: Fortitude North and Fortitude South. The first was aimed at Norway, a feint to pin down German troops far from France. The second, Fortitude South, was the main act, focused entirely on convincing Hitler that Patton's Phantom Army in southeast England would cross the Channel at Pas-de-Calais. But deception isn't built in a day. It required imagination, patience, and an understanding of how men think under pressure. The Allies would have to choreograph a war that didn't exist. Troop movements, supply convoys, radio chatter, even gossip in pubs that might reach a German ear. In a sense, The plan turned every Allied soldier, spy, and artist into an actor on the grandest stage in history. The curtain was rising. The props, inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, fake landing craft, were already in the wings. The script was written in static and secrecy, and the audience, the German High Command, waited eagerly to be deceived. The world would soon learn that the greatest battles aren't always fought with bullets. Sometimes they're won with the elegance of a lie. The Germans believed in one thing above all: reputation, and no Allied general had a greater one than George S. Patton. To them, Patton was more than a man. He was a force of nature. He moved tanks like chess pieces, swore like artillery, and attacked like thunder. Wherever Patton went, the German lines broke. To the Nazi High Command, if Patton commanded an army, it had to be the main invasion force. The Allies knew this, and they decided to turn that belief into a weapon. Thus was born the most convincing ghost army in human history, the first U.S. Army Group. It existed only on paper, in whispers, and in the imagination of the enemy. But to the Germans, it became real, an unstoppable American juggernaut waiting in southeast England, staring across the narrowest part of the English Channel toward Pas-de-Calais. The illusion had to be perfect. At the center of it stood Patton himself. Officially, he'd been sidelined after the Sicily incident, punished for slapping a shell-shocked soldier. But quietly, he was placed in command of this new army group. The move wasn't random. Allied intelligence wanted every German ear to hear that Patton was back, angry, ambitious, and ready for revenge. Fake headquarters were built in Kent, Sussex, and around Dover, places directly opposite Calais. From the sky, the German Luftwaffe would see an army forming. What they didn't know was that almost everything was fake. There were rubber tanks, full-sized Sherman lookalikes that could be inflated in hours. Wooden artillery guns pointed toward the coast. Aircraft made of canvas were lined up neatly on fake runways. Even entire supply dumps were staged, complete with oil drums and crates made of cardboard. At night, dummy landing craft bobbed in harbors made of scaffolding and lights, giving the illusion of hundreds of ships preparing for an invasion. By day, real soldiers, mostly a few thousand actors from special deception units, moved between sites, creating the illusion of hundreds of thousands. They painted insignias, marked vehicles, and marched in circles to leave tire tracks and footprints for German reconnaissance to spot. Every sound, every signal, every movement was a performance. The deception went beyond what eyes could see. It reached the airwaves. Special radio teams, known as the Signal Company Special, filled the air with fake transmissions, troop orders, logistics chatter, and coded reports, all designed to mimic the patterns of a massive field army. Messages were routed through real command lines so that German intelligence could intercept them. The chatter was so authentic that even some Allied officers occasionally believed the phantom units existed. And then came the double agents, perhaps the most dangerous actors in the play. Men like Garbo, the Spanish double agent, whose real name was Juan Pujol Garcia. He'd built an entire network of fictional sub-agents that fed German intelligence carefully curated lies. Through him, the Germans received reports of Patton's massive army training in southeast England. Every detail was designed to match the visual evidence from the air. The Germans were drowning in proof that didn't exist. To reinforce the illusion, Allied newspapers began printing small, deliberate leaks. Local shopkeepers in Kent were told to prepare for American soldiers arriving soon. Farmers were instructed not to harvest fields where tank units were parked. Even pub gossip became a weapon, every rumor another thread in the web of deception. By May 1944, the first U.S. Army Group seemed as real as any on Earth. The Germans counted over 11 full divisions, roughly 150,000 troops, all under Patton's banner, facing Calais. Their spies reported convoys, supply chains, and ship movements. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed it. Every photograph, every intercepted message, every rumor matched. The German High Command became absolutely convinced. Hitler himself issued orders. The main attack will come at Calais. Normandy is only a diversion. The brilliance of the lie was that it needed no new technology, only imagination. It was theater on a global stage, a war of shadows, crafted by men who understood that deception is not just about hiding the truth, it's about showing something even more believable. And Patton? He played his role to perfection. He toured the southeast countryside, appearing at real events, inspecting troops that didn't exist. German agents tracked his movements, confirming their worst fears. To them, it was proof that the most feared general in the Allied ranks was ready to lead the decisive invasion, straight across the Channel to Calais. The Allies had built an army out of air, and the Germans saluted it. When the real invasion began in Normandy, they refused to move their reserves, convinced it was just a trick to draw them away from Calais. The ghost of Patton's army had chained the German divisions exactly where the Allies wanted them. A lie had done what no bullet could. By early June 1944, the greatest stage performance in military history was ready to begin. The actors were in place, the props were set, and the audience, the German High Command, was watching every move. But this wasn't just about rubber tanks and fake radios anymore. It was about timing, psychology, and belief. The Allies had to make the Germans believe, even as real bombs began to fall elsewhere. The night before D-Day, storm clouds rolled across the English Channel. The air was heavy with rain, wind, and tension. To the German radar operators, the weather looked impossible for an invasion. Yet deep beneath those same clouds, thousands of ships were moving toward Normandy. Meanwhile, the ghost army of Patton, FUSAG, the first U.S. Army group, was playing its part to perfection. Their fake radio network came alive with static and coded messages. Operators used prearranged scripts, mimicking the daily chatter of divisions that didn't exist. Convoy A moving north. Supplies ready for embarkation. Short, clipped phrases the German intelligence eagerly recorded. Every message confirmed what Berlin already believed. The invasion would come at Calais. The deception didn't stop there. On the night of June 5th, as Allied ships crossed the Channel toward Normandy, Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable began. Two aerial illusions meant to fool German radar. Small squadrons of bombers flew precise paths over the water, dropping clouds of aluminum strips window to create phantom echoes. To radar operators in northern France, it looked like two massive invasion fleets heading straight for Calais. German searchlights swept the horizon. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire into empty seas. The ghosts were moving. When dawn came on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy exploded into chaos. The real invasion was underway, but in Hitler's headquarters, confusion ruled. Reports flooded in, hundreds of landings in Normandy, but also radar readings showing ships near Calais. To the German mind, it was clear. Normandy was a feint. The main attack would come later, led by Patton, the real general of the real army. The deception was working even better than anyone imagined. For days, Hitler refused to release the panzer divisions stationed around Calais. The 15th Army, more than 150,000 men, sat waiting, watching the empty horizon for an invasion that would never come. Meanwhile, in Normandy, the Allies were fighting for every inch of ground. Supplies were short, casualties high. But the one thing they didn't face was the full German reserve, because the ghosts had trapped them elsewhere. The Phantom Army didn't rest. In late June, the fake radio traffic continued. Allied intelligence even staged new construction of landing craft and fuel depots in Kent. The deception needed to stay alive for as long as possible. By mid-July, captured German documents showed just how successful it had been. Even after the Allies had broken through Normandy, German commanders still expected another invasion at Calais. They believed Patton's army, the invisible juggernaut, was still preparing to cross. It wasn't until August that the truth began to crack. German reconnaissance flights found fewer vehicles, fewer camps, fewer soldiers in southern England. Still, many officers dismissed it as a trick. After all, how could an army so big, so obvious, just disappear? But by then, it didn't matter. The damage was done. The deception had bought the Allies 7 crucial weeks, enough time to secure the Normandy bridgehead, break out through France, and set Europe ablaze. Later, when Allied officers reviewed the deception plan, they realized something chilling. If the Germans had moved their Calais reserves even 2 days sooner, D-Day might have failed. But they didn't. They couldn't because the ghosts of Patton's army were too convincing to ignore. For a brief moment in 1944, a handful of artists, radio men, and inflatable tanks had done the impossible. They'd beaten one of the most powerful armies on Earth without firing a single shot. The war had entered a new era, one where imagination could win battles. The Ghost Army may have painted illusions in the fields of England, but one man, one double agent, painted them inside Hitler's mind. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia, but to British intelligence, he was Agent Garbo. To the Germans, he was Agent Arabelle, their most trusted spy in Britain. In truth, he worked for both, but his loyalty was only to one side, and his lies would shape the fate of the Second World War. Garbo wasn't a soldier, nor a trained spy. He was a hotel clerk, a failed businessman, a man who hated dictators. When the war began, he offered his services to the British. They refused. So he decided to fool the Germans first, just to prove he could, using fake names, fake reports, and a typewriter. He built an entire network of imaginary agents across Britain. He claimed to have pilots, dock workers, even government clerks feeding him inside information. In reality, it was all fiction, written from his room with nothing but British newspapers and wild imagination. The Germans believed every word. They paid him, trusted him, and sent him codes and radios. Finally, British intelligence noticed and brought him in. They realized they had stumbled on the perfect weapon, a spy who could make the enemy believe anything. Garbo was placed under the care of MI5. He and his handler, Thomas Harris, built a fake empire of 27 agents. Each one had a life story, habits, locations, even expense reports. Garbo wrote letters in their voices, mixing truth with fiction so cleverly that German intelligence couldn't separate the two. Every report was designed for one goal: to make the Germans believe the real invasion would not come at Normandy. When the Allies began planning Operation Fortitude, Garbo became the heart of it. He told Berlin that Patton's army, the first US Army group, was preparing near Dover. He described the fake camps, the fuel depots, the vehicle movements, all in detail. The Germans cross-checked his reports with their own aerial photos and saw exactly what he described, because the Ghost Army had made it real. It was the perfect illusion. Garbo's words gave life to the lies on the ground. Inflatable tanks and dummy trucks became proof of his intelligence. The Germans believed they had their best man right in the middle of the Allied command. By May 1944, Garbo's influence was so strong that Berlin sent him a message: when the invasion begins, inform us immediately. The moment came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Before dawn, Allied troops landed in Normandy. Garbo sent a report. Too late on purpose. He claimed his courier had been delayed, a believable excuse. That single delay convinced German high command that the Normandy landings were only a diversion. Hours later, Garbo sent another message, this one crucial. He told the Germans that the real invasion would come at Calais, led by General Patton. The Germans swallowed it whole. They held back their best divisions, waiting for an attack that never came. For 7 weeks, Hitler refused to move them. He believed Garbo completely, even after Allied tanks rolled deep into France. Berlin insisted The main blow has yet to fall. Garbo had become a legend, though no one outside MI5 knew it. His fake agents were awarded medals by the German High Command. They even sent him an Iron Cross, signed by Hitler himself. Imagine that, a medal from Hitler for helping defeat Hitler. By the time the Germans realized the truth, it was too late. Normandy was lost. Paris was free. The Allied advance was unstoppable. After the war, Garbo disappeared. Many thought he had died in Africa, but decades later, he was found alive, living quietly in Venezuela, far from the world he once deceived. When interviewed, he said something simple: "I only used lies to serve the truth." Garbo's genius wasn't in stealing secrets, it was in creating belief. He turned deception into art, and art into victory. Without him, Hitler might have seen through the illusion. Without him, Calais might not have held back the panzers. Without him, D-Day might not have succeeded. In the end, it wasn't just tanks, planes, or guns that won the war. It was the power of a story told so perfectly. The enemy couldn't tell it was false. It began with a whisper, a low rumble in the distance, like thunder rolling across the English countryside. To those who knew the truth, it wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a lie being born. The Ghost Army was ready. Weeks of preparation, sleepless nights, and careful choreography had led to this single moment. It was early May 1944. Less than a month before D-Day, and across the counties of Kent and Essex, the illusion of war began to move. Under the cover of mist, a convoy appeared on the narrow country roads. Rows of jeeps, half-tracks, and Sherman tanks crept toward the coast. Engines rumbled, dust billowed, headlights flickered in the fog. To anyone watching, from the ground or the air, it was the unmistakable sight of a great army on the move. But here's the twist. Most of those tanks weren't made of steel. They were made of rubber, inflatable Shermans, painted olive drab, their seams hidden under nets and mud, bounced slightly with the wind as they were towed by real jeeps. Their crews, artists, engineers, sound technicians, wore fake unit patches of Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group. Every movement, every noise, every radio signal had been rehearsed to perfection. From above, it looked completely authentic. From the ground, it felt alive, and from across the channel, it looked like the beginning of the end. Just after dawn, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane lifted off from Abbeville in northern France. The pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Becker, had been flying missions like this for months. His orders were clear: photograph the English coast, especially the Dover area, where German intelligence suspected the Allies were preparing their main invasion. Becker crossed the channel under low clouds. He broke through the mist, and then he saw it. Below him, winding like a steel serpent through the English countryside, was a massive convoy. Dozens of trucks, half-tracks, fuel carriers, and tanks moved toward the coast. Some appeared to stop for refueling. Others formed neat columns in open fields. He could even see what looked like ammunition dumps, tents and fuel depots near Dover. Becker clicked his Leica camera again and again. "Got him, Himmel," he whispered. He couldn't believe the scale of what he was seeing. When he returned to base, the film was developed immediately. Analysts huddled around the light tables. The photos were clear. Patton's army was real. The report raced up the chain of command. By the next morning, it reached Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. For weeks, German intelligence had debated where the invasion would come. Normandy seemed possible, but too obvious, too open. Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the Channel, seemed far more logical. And now, Becker's photographs gave them proof. Patton's Phantom Army, the 1st U.S. Army Group, appeared to be gathering right across from Calais. Hitler's analysts marked the convoy's path on their maps with red ink. Their conclusion was absolute. The enemy's main force is preparing for an assault on the Pas-de-Calais sector. The deception had worked. What Becker had photographed wasn't a real army at all. It was a looping illusion, created by the same 20 trucks driving in endless circles through Kent's countryside. Each loop was timed, so that when one truck disappeared behind the hills, another appeared on a parallel road. From above, it looked like an endless stream of movement, a 10-mile-long army that didn't exist. Sound trucks hidden in the woods blasted recordings of tanks revving, gears grinding, men shouting orders, and artillery shells being loaded. Microphones recorded actual US maneuvers weeks earlier at Fort Knox, and now those sounds echoed through the English fields. The illusion was perfect. Even the smoke rising from the fake fuel dumps was engineered. Diesel-soaked straw burned slowly under metal barrels, creating plumes of black smoke visible from miles away. One British officer joked, "We were the only army in history where a flat tire could ruin an invasion." The following week, the Germans sent another recon flight. Different pilot, different route, but the same result: more photos, more proof. Hitler's intelligence officers were convinced. To reinforce the deception, the double-cross agents added fuel to the fire. Agent Garbo radioed Berlin, confirming heavy troop convoys moving east. Another agent, Brutus, reported increased activity and patterns personal. Inspections. Each lie was carefully coordinated with the visual tricks of the ghost. Every message matched what the Luftwaffe's cameras had seen. The result was devastatingly effective. By late May 1944, Hitler ordered the 15th Army, his most elite force, to remain in Calais, ready to strike back against Patton's expected landing. Those troops never moved to Normandy. On June 2, 1944, a final recon mission confirmed the deception one last time. The convoy still moved, the smoke still rose, and the Phantom Army still breathed. The German report was triumphantly filed. The main Allied invasion force under General Patton is positioned opposite Calais. Normandy shows minor activity only. In that moment, in the flicker of that report, and the flick of Hitler's signature, at the bottom, the fate of Europe shifted. The convoy that never was had just rewritten history. The Allies' greatest strength that night wasn't armor or firepower, it was belief. The belief that what they were seeing was true. And when the Germans saw that convoy for themselves, the world's greatest lie became the Allies' greatest victory. By late August 1944, the Red Ball Express had become something beyond a supply line. It was a living, roaring artery that pulsed through the heart of France. The trucks rolled without pause, day and night, a thunderous procession of engines and courage. The men behind the wheel were exhausted, but the mission didn't allow rest. Every gallon of fuel, every box of ammunition, every loaf of bread they carried meant another mile closer to victory. There was no schedule, only the order to move, to keep moving until the job was done. At first light, the convoys began to stir. The smell of diesel mixed with the damp morning air. As tired soldiers splashed cold water on their faces, grabbed a can of coffee, and climbed back into the driver's seat. Engines coughed, sputtered, then roared to life in unison. The sound rolled across the French countryside like distant thunder. By sunrise, the Red Ball roads were alive again. From Normandy to Chartres, from Alençon to Paris, trucks lined up in endless rows, green, mud-streaked and battle-worn. The drivers called it the convoy that never slept, and they weren't exaggerating. There were no weekends, no nights off, and almost no comfort. The rule was simple: keep the trucks rolling. If a driver grew too tired to go on, his buddy would slide over and take the wheel, sometimes while the truck was still in motion. They drove through rain and fog, through towns still smoldering from battle. Their headlights blacked out to avoid German air raids. Most of the drivers were young black soldiers from the Quartermaster Corps. For many, this was their first time in Europe, and the first time anyone had trusted them with such responsibility. The army was still segregated then, and they had often been given the dullest, dirtiest jobs back home. But here on the Red Ball Express, they were the difference between victory and disaster. They didn't carry rifles or storm beaches, but their courage was just as vital. General Patton himself said that without their trucks, his tanks would stop in their tracks. Every convoy was a gamble. The roads were narrow and rough, filled with wreckage from retreating Germans. Bridges were half destroyed, and some routes were just dirt paths cut through the countryside. Trucks slipped and skidded through mud, their heavy loads pushing the limits of the engines. Tires blew, brakes failed, and transmissions gave out, but stopping was not an option. Mechanics followed the convoys, fixing trucks on the fly, sometimes under fire. If a truck couldn't be repaired quickly, it was pushed to the roadside and stripped for parts so the others could keep going. Fuel was the lifeblood of the Red Bull. Each day, over 1 million gallons were hauled forward for Patton's Third Army alone. Drivers nicknamed the fuel drums liquid gold. One spark, one stray bullet, and a whole convoy could go up in flames. Yet they kept hauling, through sniper fire, through bombed-out towns, through roads that seemed to go on forever. What made it harder was the loneliness. Convoys often ran for 12, even 16 hours straight. The soldiers were far from home, sleeping in their trucks, eating cold rations, and writing quick letters when they could. They sang to stay awake, blues, gospel, swing, and passed stories down the line through CB radios or shouted across the wind. Each truck was its own small world, carrying one man's determination through the chaos of war. German spies began to report on the strange American supply system. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. Thousands of trucks moving in perfect rhythm, faster than any army supply chain in history. To them, it sounded like propaganda. But when Luftwaffe pilots flew reconnaissance over France, they saw it with their own eyes. A river of steel and rubber stretching from the beaches to the front lines, unstoppable. The lie, as they had called it, was terrifyingly real. Even as autumn rains began to fall, the convoys kept moving. The roads turned to rivers of mud, but the trucks pressed on, engines howling through the night. Sometimes the drivers joked that they didn't need maps anymore. They could follow the trail of broken tires and coffee cans to the front. They lived on adrenaline, determination, and the knowledge that if they failed, soldiers would go hungry and tanks would stop fighting. By September, some drivers had gone weeks without proper rest, yet morale stayed high. The Red Bull Express had become a badge of pride. They were no longer just truck drivers. They were the heartbeat of an army on the move. And though history often forgets their names, those men in their rumbling GMCs kept the war alive mile after mile. Every turn of the wheel was a promise. We will keep going, no matter what. By early September 1944, German intelligence officers were desperate to understand how the Allied advance had become so unstoppable. Their reports told of tanks moving hundreds of miles without pause, of infantry divisions supplied faster than they could retreat. It made no sense. The Allies' front lines were far ahead of their ports. Logistically, it should have been impossible. The German High Command began to suspect that the stories of a massive truck network, the so-called Red Bull Express, were simply Allied propaganda. But disbelief quickly turned into fear. Reconnaissance pilots flying high over France began sending back photographs that defied logic. In the grainy black and white images, endless streams of trucks could be seen snaking across the countryside, bumper to bumper, forming a continuous flow of motion. At first, analysts thought the photos had been staged. No army could coordinate that many vehicles moving that fast across war-torn roads. Yet new photographs kept coming, day after day. Convoy after convoy, proof that the impossible was real. The Luftwaffe sent planes to shadow the convoys, but the Red Bull routes were protected by Allied fighters. The Germans rarely got close enough to attack, and when they did, they found the convoys impossible to stop. Destroy one bridge, and the engineers built another overnight. Bomb a road, and bulldozers cleared it by morning. It was like fighting an enemy made of steel and determination, one that refused to rest. What the Germans didn't realize was how chaotic the Red Bull really was up close. The drivers were exhausted, the trucks battered, and fuel shortages constant. But from the sky it looked perfect, like a living machine. The Germans couldn't understand how an army could move so much, so far, so fast. Their own forces were still using horse-drawn wagons and rail lines that had been bombed into dust. The contrast was devastating. One captured German officer later admitted that when he first saw the convoys through binoculars, he thought he was witnessing an invasion all over again. "They came like a river that never ended," he said. "We thought it was a lie. But it was a lie that became truth before our eyes." The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply line, it was psychological warfare. Every time German troops looked west, they saw movement, noise, and power. It sent a clear message: the Allies could not be stopped. Even when fuel was short, even when the men were tired, the convoys rolled on. The Germans, who had relied on strict precision and rigid control, were facing an enemy powered by speed, improvisation, and raw will. In a war filled with tanks, planes, and guns, the Germans had overlooked the simplest weapon of all, the truck. And now they watched helplessly as thousands of them carved their way across France, carrying not just supplies, but the unstoppable momentum of victory.